He's just a janitor, Rachel? Really? The words cut through the cozy hum of Christmas chatter like ice on glass. Rachel Carter froze in the doorway, her hand gripping the strap of her purse a little too tightly, her heart thumping in a mixture of dread and disbelief. It had been years since she had faced her ex-husband, Brandon Carter, and yet the sting of his sarcasm felt as fresh as ever. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she had agreed to attend this family dinner in the first place, despite the knots of anxiety twisting in her stomach. Beside her, Ethan Walker, her fiancé, smiled calmly, a warmth in his eyes that seemed to anchor her in a world suddenly spinning with tension. Ethan wasn't just calm, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that made Rachel's nerves settle just a bit. As they stepped into the living room, the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree reflected in Brandon's eyes, a mischievous glint that sent a shiver down her spine. Brandon was already mid-sentence, leaning casually against the doorframe with that smirk Rachel had known too well, ready to unleash a volley of jokes aimed at Ethan, whom he clearly intended to humiliate in front of everyone. The room buzzed with chatter, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon mingling in the air, but Brandon's words cut through it all. "So this is the famous janitor you've been seeing, Rachel? I hope he brought his mop and bucket to help with dinner." Laughter erupted around the table, and Rachel's stomach sank as familiar faces, her own parents and siblings, giggled at the jab. Even her kids, young teens caught in the whirlwind of their father's influence, snickered and exchanged amused glances. Rachel's chest tightened. She forced a smile, keeping her voice steady as she introduced Ethan properly, careful not to let the venom in Brandon's words touch the calm dignity Ethan radiated. Ethan's smile never wavered, his eyes scanning the room with a subtle understanding that Rachel couldn't quite place, a silent reassurance that he knew more than everyone realized. As they moved further into the room, Brandon's humor escalated, a series of pointed remarks that seemed designed to embarrass Ethan further, each one landing with exaggerated timing. Rachel felt her face warm, a mix of embarrassment and protective fury, yet she held her tongue, remembering the advice Ethan had given her: stay calm, let your actions speak louder than words. Guests murmured and chuckled, unaware of the tension spiraling under the surface. The children, caught between loyalty and amusement, continued their laughter, while Rachel subtly placed a hand on Ethan's arm, drawing strength from his composed presence. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging her support without interrupting the flow of conversation, his silence more powerful than any defense he could have offered. The air was thick with expectation, each moment stretching longer than the last, every laugh from Brandon and the guests a tiny spark threatening to ignite Rachel's frustration, but she held steady, her mind racing, analyzing the scene, anticipating the subtle turn she sensed was coming. It was a delicate balance, maintaining composure, protecting her children from humiliation, and quietly observing Ethan's reaction to the relentless teasing. The smell of pine from the tree mixed with the sweet aroma of cookies, grounding her senses, yet the tension was palpable, as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Rachel's pulse quickened when Brandon leaned in, voice dripping with mock admiration. "Well, I guess you've really outdone yourself this time, Rachel. Who knew your janitor could make it through a proper family dinner?" The laughter that followed was sharper, echoing around the room, yet Ethan's serene smile never faltered. He gave a subtle nod, a tiny acknowledgement that Rachel caught, and in that moment she realized the evening might be more than just a simple holiday gathering. It was the stage for something far greater than Brandon's petty insults, a test of patience, dignity, and perhaps hidden truths waiting to surface at the perfect moment. Rachel followed the others into the dining room, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling settling deeper in her chest with every passing minute. The long table was decorated beautifully, covered with holiday candles, red ribbons, and carefully arranged plates that her mother proudly set out every Christmas. On the surface, everything looked warm and welcoming. Underneath, however, the atmosphere felt completely different. Brandon took the seat at the center of the table as if he owned the room, immediately drawing attention to himself. He lifted a glass and grinned. "I have to admit, Rachel always surprises me. Every year there is something new." Several family members chuckled before he even continued. "This year she brought building maintenance. More laughter followed. Rachel noticed her brother nearly spit out his drink while her sister covered her mouth, trying and failing to hide her amusement. Ethan simply pulled out Rachel's chair for her before taking his own seat. His calmness was almost unsettling. Most people would have become defensive by now. Most people would have argued. Ethan did neither. Brandon seemed disappointed by that. Rachel could see it in his face. He wanted a reaction. He wanted a confrontation. Instead, Ethan politely thanked Rachel's mother for inviting him and complimented the meal. That only encouraged Brandon to push harder. "Tell me something, Ethan," he said while carving a slice of turkey. "How many floors do you clean in a typical week?" The table erupted again. Rachel felt heat rising into her cheeks. Before she could respond, Ethan smiled. "Enough to stay busy." The answer was simple, polite, and impossible to attack. Brandon laughed louder. "At least he is honest." Rachel's father leaned back in his chair. "Nothing wrong with hard work," he said, although his tone lacked conviction. Rachel knew her father was attempting to appear fair without actually standing up for Ethan. The distinction hurt. Then came the moment that stung the most. Her son Tyler, who had just turned 15, looked directly at Ethan and said, "Do you really wear one of those uniforms every day?" Several people laughed again. Rachel immediately looked toward him. "Tyler." Her voice carried a warning. But the damage had already been done. Her daughter Emma joined in. "Mom used to date lawyers and business owners." She shrugged. "This is definitely different." Rachel felt her heart sink. She knew teenagers could be influenced easily. She knew Brandon had spent years shaping their opinions. Still, hearing the words come from her children hurt more than every joke Brandon had made. Ethan never showed the slightest sign of anger. "Different is not always bad," he said gently. Emma looked away. Tyler focused on his plate. For a brief moment, silence settled across the table. Rachel hoped the conversation would move on. It did not. Brandon stood and walked toward the Christmas tree. Underneath it sat several wrapped gifts. He picked up one small box and turned toward the room. "You know what is funny?" he asked. "Everybody spends years building careers, chasing success, trying to improve their lives. Then some people decide none of that matters." His eyes landed directly on Rachel. "They settle." Rachel immediately understood what he was implying. The room became painfully quiet. Every person at the table waited for her response. She opened her mouth, prepared to defend Ethan, but his hand lightly touched hers beneath the table. The gesture stopped her. Not because he was controlling the situation. Because somehow he seemed completely unbothered by it. Almost as if Brandon was performing exactly as expected. Rachel glanced at him. Ethan remained relaxed, his expression steady, his eyes calm. For the first time that evening, she noticed something unusual. Every insult seemed to strengthen his confidence rather than weaken it. That realization sent a strange feeling through her. Brandon believed he was in control of the room. Everyone else seemed to believe it too. Yet sitting beside Ethan, Rachel suddenly had the unmistakable sense that the evening was moving towards something none of them could see coming. Rachel barely had time to steady her breathing before the soft chime of the doorbell interrupted the tension-filled room. She looked at Ethan, whose calm gaze gave her an unspoken reassurance, and then back toward Brandon, who immediately straightened his posture, clearly intrigued by the unexpected interruption. A man in a sharp black suit entered, followed by two assistants carrying small leather portfolios. "Mr. Walker?" the man asked politely, addressing Ethan. "We have an urgent matter regarding the Westbrook property acquisition." The words hung in the air like a sudden storm. Brandon blinked, confused, and Rachel's mother frowned, uncertain what to make of the scene. Ethan stood gracefully and nodded. "Of course. Please come in." He gestured toward the living room while Brandon's jaw tightened, the color draining from his face as he realized the seriousness of the interruption. The guests murmured in curiosity, trying to decipher the sudden shift in energy. Tyler and Emma leaned forward, sensing the importance but unsure of what it meant. Ethan returned to Rachel's side, speaking in a quiet tone only she could hear. "This will only take a moment. Just stay calm." Rachel swallowed, a mix of excitement and apprehension swirling in her chest, as she watched Ethan escort the visitors with the same quiet dignity that had already impressed her. Brandon, growing impatient and suspicious, followed closely, asking questions that were met with polite but firm responses from Ethan. Soon, the assistants pulled out documents and charts that clearly illustrated Ethan's leadership over a multi-million-dollar property management company. Every detail was precise, professional, and beyond anything the casual onlooker could have anticipated. The room fell silent as the family processed the revelation. Ethan, the man Brandon had ridiculed for his job and maintenance, was revealed to be a prominent entrepreneur, one whose influence directly intersected with Brandon's own work and investments. Rachel could hardly believe the transformation unfolding in front of her eyes. Brandon's smirk faltered, replaced by a flush of embarrassment that grew with every chart, every confident explanation delivered by Ethan without ever raising his voice or showing irritation. Tyler and Emma's mouths fell open as they realized they had misjudged him, their laughter and mockery from earlier replaced by astonished silence. Rachel felt a surge of pride mixed with relief. She had stood by Ethan through years of judgment, and now the truth could no longer be hidden. Ethan returned to the table with a small, polite smile, acknowledging the visitor's departure with a nod. He sat down calmly, his presence radiating assurance and understated power. Brandon opened his mouth, attempting to reclaim some semblance of control, but the effect was immediate and contrary to his intentions. The family's eyes, previously gleaming with mischief and doubt, now focused on Ethan with respect, admiration, and curiosity. Rachel noticed her father leaning forward, nodding slightly, while her mother's hand flew to her mouth in surprise. Her sister's eyes widened, and even Brandon's closest friends around the table looked unsure of how to react. Brandon attempted a joke, but it fell flat, echoing hollowly against the newly shifted atmosphere. Rachel reached for Ethan's hand beneath the table, feeling the warmth and steady reassurance that had always been there, now magnified by the unfolding revelation. Ethan's quiet composure, his refusal to react with anger or defensiveness, had turned every insult thrown at him into a testament of patience and integrity. Rachel's chest swelled with gratitude and admiration as she finally saw the full measure of the man she had chosen. The children, still staring, now whispered among themselves, processing the lessons they had learned in a single evening. Appearances were deceiving, humility carried strength, and kindness could overshadow cruelty. Brandon, now left alone in his embarrassment, could only force a strained smile, the realization of his misjudgment dawning fully. Rachel exhaled, allowing herself to finally relax as she watched the rest of the evening unfold in a harmony of respect, quiet laughter, and genuine connection, a Christmas transformed from tension and ridicule into a celebration of integrity, love, and unexpected triumph. Rachel could feel the entire atmosphere of the house changing minute by minute. Only an hour earlier, the room had been filled with laughter directed at Ethan. Now those same people seemed eager to learn everything they could about him. Her sister Melissa leaned forward with a smile that looked noticeably different from the one she had worn earlier. "You never mentioned you owned a company that large," she said. Ethan simply shrugged. "Nobody asked?" A few nervous laughs circled the table. Rachel noticed the discomfort immediately. Everyone remembered exactly how they had treated him. Her father cleared his throat. "That is impressive, son. Very impressive." Rachel almost smiled at the sudden change. Earlier, her father had barely looked Ethan in the eye. Now he sounded as if he were speaking to an honored guest. Across the table, Brandon stabbed at a piece of turkey with unnecessary force. The revelation had clearly shaken him, but Rachel knew him well enough to understand that he was not finished. Brandon had spent years building his image around being the most successful person in every room. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, that position had slipped away. "Owning a company does not automatically make someone special," Brandon said casually. "A lot of people get lucky." The room fell quiet again. Rachel rolled her eyes internally. There it was. The next attack. Ethan calmly sipped his water. That is true, he replied. Luck can help. But consistency matters more. Brandon forced a smile. I suppose. The answer left him nowhere to go. Rachel almost laughed. Ethan never fought. He never argued. Yet somehow he always ended up winning the exchange. Meanwhile, Tyler and Emma sat unusually quiet. Rachel watched her son stealing glances toward Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. Finally, Tyler spoke. You really started the company yourself? Ethan nodded. I started with one building and a pickup truck. Tyler's eyes widened. Seriously? Seriously. Emma looked equally surprised. Then why do you still do maintenance work? Several family members seemed interested in the answer as well. Ethan rested his hands on the table. Because I enjoy understanding every part of the business. The people who maintain buildings are just as important as the people who manage them. If I ever forget that, I stop being a good leader. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. Rachel noticed her children absorbing every word. It was the first time all evening they seemed genuinely engaged. Her mother suddenly looked embarrassed. I think we may have made some unfair assumptions tonight. Ethan smiled warmly. Most people do. There was no bitterness in his voice. No accusation. That made Rachel admire him even more. Many people would have used the opportunity to embarrass everyone who had mocked them. Ethan refused to do that. Brandon, however, seemed increasingly frustrated by the growing respect Ethan was receiving. He stood and walked toward the fireplace, attempting to reclaim the room's attention. Well, regardless, he announced, some of us have spent years building our reputations. Rachel immediately recognized the tone. Brandon was preparing something. He was not ready to accept defeat. In fact, he continued, my company is preparing for its biggest expansion yet. He looked around proudly. The promotion I have been working toward is practically guaranteed. Several guests nodded politely. Yet the reaction was nowhere near as enthusiastic as Brandon expected. Everyone's attention kept drifting back toward Ethan. Rachel could see it irritating him. Then Brandon made a mistake. He looked directly at Ethan and smiled. Maybe one day we can even do business together. The comment sounded harmless on the surface, but Rachel heard the challenge hidden underneath. Ethan held his gaze for a moment. Then he gave a polite nod. Perhaps. The simple response should have ended the conversation. Instead, it created an unexpected tension. For the first time all evening, Ethan's expression became difficult to read. Rachel noticed it immediately. Something had changed. Something Brandon did not notice. But Rachel did. And as she watched Ethan quietly return his attention to the dinner table, she had the unmistakable feeling that the evening's biggest surprise had not happened yet. Rachel watched as the tension in the room subtly shifted, the energy no longer dominated by Brandon's attempts at control. Ethan had returned to his seat with a quiet composure that seemed to draw the attention of everyone present, yet no one dared to question him directly. The children sat closer now, eyes wide and filled with curiosity, absorbing every small gesture and word he offered. Rachel could feel the pride swelling in her chest as she realized the profound impact he was having without ever raising his voice. Brandon attempted to redirect the conversation toward his own successes, enumerating his achievements, the awards, and promotions he had accumulated over the years. Yet the room did not respond with the enthusiasm he anticipated. Instead, glances shifted back to Ethan, to the man who had been ridiculed only an hour earlier and now carried himself with an undeniable dignity that made every insult seem insignificant. Rachel's mother cleared her throat, glancing from Brandon to Ethan and back again. It is remarkable, she admitted softly, to see someone so confident and calm in the face of challenges. Rachel noticed the subtle shift in her sister Melissa's expression, the earlier smirk replaced by genuine curiosity. Ethan nodded appreciatively at the comment, a small, polite smile touching his lips. Confidence comes from understanding your own value and respecting the value of others, he replied, his tone gentle yet firm. Brandon's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the room's attention subtly slipping from him. He tried to maintain control, attempting to interject humor and anecdotes about his own career milestones, but they lacked the previous sharpness. The room no longer fully entertained his narrative. Rachel noticed Tyler whispering to Emma, sharing observations that betrayed their surprise. "I cannot believe he started all this by himself," Tyler said quietly, his voice filled with admiration. Emma nodded, still staring in astonishment. Rachel caught Ethan's eye and felt a reassuring calm emanate from him, a silent reminder that patience and integrity often spoke louder than any boastful words. Brandon, growing increasingly unsettled, attempted a final, subtle challenge. He leaned slightly forward and said, "Perhaps one day our companies will work together, Walker. It would be interesting to see how our skills compare." The statement was meant to assert dominance, to provoke Ethan into a competitive response. Ethan paused, his calm gaze steady, and replied with a simple, measured tone. "Perhaps. Collaboration can bring out the best in all of us." The words, quiet and unassuming, carried an unspoken authority that resonated through the room. Guests shifted in their seats, impressed by the elegance of his response. Rachel's mother exchanged a glance with Rachel, the unspoken acknowledgement of Ethan's quiet strength reflected in their eyes. Brandon, meanwhile, could feel the evening slipping from his grasp. Every attempt to reclaim control seemed only to emphasize the growing respect and admiration directed toward Ethan. Rachel's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. She reached for Ethan's hand beneath the table, squeezing it gently. He responded with a nod and a reassuring smile, as if to say that this was only the beginning. The children, once quick to mock, now leaned forward with keen interest, absorbing lessons far beyond the holiday conversation. Rachel realized that Ethan had quietly demonstrated resilience, wisdom, and patience in a way that no argument or rebuttal could have achieved. The room, once filled with laughter at Ethan's expense, now seemed to revolve around his presence, a subtle but undeniable shift that left Brandon momentarily speechless, a lesson in humility unfolding before everyone's eyes. The conversation gradually shifted away from Brandon's attempts to impress the room, and for the first time all evening, Rachel noticed genuine warmth replacing the earlier tension. Her mother began asking Ethan questions about his business, not out of obligation, but out of sincere interest. Her father listened carefully as Ethan explained how he had spent years learning every aspect of property management, from maintenance schedules to long-term investment planning. Tyler and Emma remained unusually quiet, absorbing every word. Rachel could almost see their opinions changing in real time. Then, just as the atmosphere finally seemed to settle, a sharp vibration broke the calm. Ethan's phone lit up on the table. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time that evening, Rachel noticed a slight change in his expression. It was not concern. It was focus. Ethan politely excused himself. "I need to take this call. I will only be a minute." He stepped away from the table and walked into the hallway. Brandon watched him leave, his eyes narrowing slightly. Rachel recognized that look. Whenever Brandon felt uncertain, he became suspicious. The room continued chatting quietly, but Brandon's attention never left the hallway. Several minutes passed. Ethan's voice remained low and professional. Rachel could not hear the conversation, but she noticed something else. The confidence in his posture had not changed. Whatever was happening, Ethan clearly expected it. When he finally returned, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and resumed his seat. Rachel leaned closer. "Everything okay?" Ethan smiled. "Everything is fine." The answer was simple, but Rachel sensed there was more behind it. Before she could ask another question, a second phone rang. This time it was Brandon's. He glanced at the screen and immediately stood. "Excuse me." He walked toward the kitchen and answered with a confident tone. At first, Rachel paid little attention. Then she noticed Brandon's expression changing. The confidence disappeared. His smile faded. His posture stiffened. He began asking short questions. "What do you mean?" Pause. "When did this happen?" Another pause. Are you serious? The room gradually fell silent as everyone noticed the change. Brandon returned several minutes later looking unsettled. He tried to hide it, but Rachel knew him too well. Something was wrong. Everything okay? Her father asked. Just business, Brandon replied quickly. Nothing important. Yet his voice lacked conviction. The conversation resumed, but Brandon no longer seemed interested in controlling it. Instead, he kept checking his phone. Every few minutes another notification appeared. Rachel noticed him reading messages, then locking the screen almost immediately. The confidence that had fueled his insults earlier seemed to be evaporating. Ethan, meanwhile, remained completely composed. He engaged politely with Rachel's parents, answered Tyler's questions about entrepreneurship, and even complimented Emma's plans for college. The contrast between the two men had never been clearer. One desperately chased attention. The other never seemed to need it. Nearly 20 minutes later, another message appeared on Brandon's phone. This time Rachel saw genuine alarm flash across his face before he could hide it. He immediately stood again. I need some air. He stepped outside onto the back patio. Through the window, Rachel could see him pacing. Her sister Melissa noticed it too. He seemed stressed. Rachel's father nodded. That is not like him. Ethan quietly sipped his coffee. Tyler suddenly looked at him. Do you know what is happening? Ethan smiled politely. Business can be unpredictable. The answer was harmless, yet something about it caught Rachel's attention. She studied Ethan carefully. There was no arrogance in his expression. No satisfaction. But there was certainty. It was the same certainty she had noticed earlier when Brandon challenged him. The same certainty she had seen when the executives arrived unexpectedly. Brandon eventually returned to the table, but he looked like a completely different man from the one who had spent the evening making jokes. He barely touched his dessert. He hardly spoke. And as Rachel watched him stare down at his phone once again, she realized something extraordinary was unfolding behind the scenes. The evening's biggest revelation had not happened yet. Whatever news Brandon was receiving seemed connected to the strange confidence Ethan had displayed all night. And for the first time, Rachel began to suspect that the true reason Ethan had remained so calm was because he already knew exactly how this night was going to end. Rachel felt a sudden shift in the room as the front door opened once again, this time with a subtle but deliberate knock that immediately drew everyone's attention. A small group of elegantly dressed individuals stepped inside, carrying briefcases and folders, their expressions composed and serious. One of them, a tall man in a navy suit, approached Ethan directly. Mr. Walker, he said formally, we have finalized the arrangements for the acquisition of the Westbrook properties. Your signature is required before year-end. The room went completely silent. Brandon's eyes widened, his confident posture faltering as he tried to process the presence of these unexpected guests. Rachel's mother gasped softly, while Melissa whispered to her husband, unable to hide her astonishment. Ethan calmly stood, nodded politely, and shook hands with the visitors, every movement deliberate, controlled, and confident. He returned to his seat with the same gentle smile he had carried all evening. Brandon, meanwhile, felt the color drain from his face as realization set in. These were not casual associates. These were key executives, high-level representatives, confirming that Ethan had not been joking or exaggerating about his business dealings. Rachel's father leaned back, astonishment evident in his expression. Tyler and Emma stared wide-eyed at Ethan, finally understanding the full extent of the man they had earlier mocked. He actually owns the company, Tyler whispered, barely audible. Emma nodded, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Brandon attempted to mask his shock with a forced laugh. Well, I suppose there are always surprises, he muttered, trying to regain control of the room, but his voice lacked conviction. The executives quietly placed the necessary documents on the table and offered a few formal instructions, speaking with authority and respect that was clearly reserved for Ethan alone. He acknowledged each person with a nod and a few polite words, never raising his voice, never demanding attention, yet commanding it naturally. Rachel felt a swell of pride and relief. Every slight, every insult he had endured from Brandon, and even her own family earlier that evening now seemed meaningless compared to the calm mastery he displayed. Brandon tried again to interject, making a remark about past experiences and his own career achievements, but the room's attention had completely shifted. Eyes were on Ethan, ears tuned to his words, absorbing the quiet strength that radiated from him. Rachel's mother whispered to Rachel, "I had no idea he was this accomplished." Rachel squeezed Ethan's hand beneath the table, sharing a silent moment of recognition for his patience and composure. The children, previously laughing at his expense, now leaned in closer, eager to hear the explanations and stories Ethan offered, their laughter replaced with fascination and admiration. Brandon finally slumped into his chair, defeated, unable to maintain the confident facade he had worn earlier. The energy in the room had transformed from mockery and tension into respect, curiosity, and awe. Rachel watched as Ethan guided the executives through the paperwork efficiently and calmly, each instruction precise, each gesture dignified. It was a performance of quiet authority, a subtle but undeniable declaration that he was not to be underestimated. Rachel realized at that moment that the evening had not just revealed Ethan's true status, it had fundamentally shifted the dynamics of the entire family gathering. Brandon, who had sought to dominate the room with ridicule, now found himself powerless, witnessing the man he had dismissed with contempt orchestrate the room effortlessly. The children looked on, learning a powerful lesson about character, humility, and the importance of respecting others. Rachel exhaled, a mixture of relief, pride, and admiration washing over her, knowing that the rest of the evening would unfold under Ethan's calm but commanding presence, and that the surprises of the night had only just begun. As the executives gathered their documents and prepared to leave, one of them paused near the doorway and turned back toward Ethan. "There is one more item you should know, sir," he said respectfully. Every conversation in the room stopped. Ethan nodded for him to continue. "The final review of the acquisition was completed this afternoon. The restructuring plan has been approved." Ethan thanked him calmly, but Rachel immediately noticed Brandon freeze. The reaction was impossible to miss. It was as if he already knew exactly which acquisition the executive was referring to. The executive continued speaking. "Several regional management positions will now report directly through the new ownership structure beginning next quarter." Brandon slowly lowered his fork. His face had become noticeably pale. Rachel looked from Brandon to Ethan, sensing that an invisible connection had just surfaced. The executive offered a polite farewell and left with the others. The front door closed. Silence filled the room. Then Brandon suddenly spoke. "Which company?" His voice sounded strained. Ethan met his gaze calmly. "Excuse me?" Brandon swallowed. "Which company was acquired?" Rachel could practically feel the tension spreading through the room. Ethan answered without hesitation. He named the property group. The moment the words left his mouth, Brandon stared at him in disbelief. Nobody else seemed to understand the significance immediately, but Rachel saw it. Brandon understood. His entire expression changed. "That is not possible," he said quietly. Ethan remained composed. "Actually, it is." Rachel's father looked confused. "What is going on?" Brandon looked around the table before finally answering. "My division works under that organization." The room fell silent again. Melissa blinked several times. "Wait. You mean?" Brandon nodded reluctantly. "The new ownership group will control the entire management structure." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Tyler looked back and forth between the two men. "Does that mean?" He stopped before finishing the question. Ethan spared him the discomfort. "It means many teams will be transitioning into the new structure over the next few months." His tone remained professional and respectful. He never once attempted to embarrass Brandon. That somehow made the situation even more powerful. Rachel could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Earlier that evening, Brandon had treated Ethan like someone beneath him. Now everyone understood that Ethan occupied a position Brandon could only dream of reaching. Yet Ethan never mentioned it. He never used it as a weapon. He never even hinted at it. Brandon looked down at the table. The confidence that had fueled his insults was completely gone. Rachel's mother quietly shook her head. I cannot believe this. Her father sighed. Neither can I. Emma finally spoke. You knew all this the entire time? Ethan smiled gently. I knew some of it. And you still sat here while everyone made fun of you? Tyler asked. Ethan nodded. People usually reveal more about themselves than they realize. The answer struck the room harder than any insult ever could. Rachel noticed. Melissa looking embarrassed. Her parents avoided eye contact. Even Brandon remained silent. For the first time all evening, everyone was forced to confront their own behavior. Rachel felt Ethan's hand gently squeeze hers beneath the table. The gesture reminded her that none of this was about revenge. It was about truth. The truth had simply arrived on its own. Tyler leaned forward. I am sorry, he said quietly. Emma nodded. Me too. Rachel felt emotion rise in her chest. Those two simple words meant more to her than all the revelations of the evening. Ethan smiled warmly at both children. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. The room seemed lighter after that. Not because the tension had disappeared completely, but because something important had changed. Respect had finally replaced judgment. Understanding had replaced assumptions. And as Rachel looked around the table, she realized Brandon's greatest loss was not professional embarrassment. It was the realization that the dignity, patience, and character Ethan had displayed all night had earned something Brandon never could demand from others. Genuine respect. The rest of the evening unfolded very differently from how Rachel had imagined when she first walked through the front door. The tension that had dominated the dinner slowly faded, replaced by quiet conversations and thoughtful reflection. For the first time in years, Rachel felt completely at peace sitting at her parents' table. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was making jokes at someone else's expense. Instead, people seemed genuinely interested in listening. Tyler and Emma remained close to Ethan for most of the evening. They asked questions about his business, his experiences, and the lessons he had learned building his company from the ground up. Ethan answered every question patiently. He never bragged. He never exaggerated. He spoke about discipline, responsibility, and treating people with respect regardless of their job title. Rachel watched her children carefully. The admiration in their eyes was obvious. More importantly, she saw something else. Growth. They were beginning to understand a lesson she had spent years trying to teach them. Character mattered more than appearances. Her father eventually stood and raised a glass. The room quieted immediately. He looked directly at Ethan. I owe you an apology, he said honestly. I judged you before I knew you. I should have known better. Rachel's mother nodded. So should I. Melissa followed a moment later. One by one, members of the family acknowledged their mistakes. None of it felt forced. None of it felt performative. It felt sincere. Ethan accepted every apology with the same grace he had shown all evening. We all make assumptions sometimes, he said. The important thing is what we choose to do after we realize we were wrong. Rachel felt her eyes sting slightly. Not because of the revelations about Ethan's success. Not because of Brandon's embarrassment. But because she was witnessing something she never thought she would see. Accountability. Growth. Understanding. Across the room, Brandon remained unusually quiet. The arrogance that had defined the beginning of the evening was gone. He sat alone with his thoughts, occasionally staring into his coffee cup. Rachel almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then something unexpected happened. Brandon stood and walked toward Ethan. The room immediately grew silent again. Rachel tensed slightly, uncertain what was coming next. Brandon stopped beside the table and took a slow breath. I was out of line tonight, he said. The admission seemed difficult for him. I made assumptions too. Ethan looked up at him calmly. Brandon continued. I thought I knew exactly who you were. He shook his head. Clearly I did not. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Ethan stood and offered his hand. Then let us start over. Brandon stared at the gesture for a moment before accepting it. The handshake lasted only a second, but it changed everything. Not because they suddenly became friends. Not because every problem disappeared. But because the cycle of judgment finally ended. Rachel felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for years. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, Rachel stepped outside onto the porch with Ethan. Snowflakes drifted gently through the cold night air. Christmas lights sparkled across the neighborhood. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They simply enjoyed the quiet. Finally, Rachel looked at him and smiled. You knew exactly how this night would end, did not you? Ethan laughed softly. Not exactly. You never seemed worried. He slipped an arm around her shoulders. Because I learned a long time ago that people eventually reveal who they are. You just have to give them enough time. Rachel rested her head against him. Looking back through the window, she could see her children helping clear the table, laughing with her parents. The atmosphere was completely different from the one that had greeted them earlier. Respect had replaced judgment. Kindness had replaced mockery. Understanding had replaced assumptions. As Rachel watched her family together beneath the glow of the Christmas lights, she realized the greatest victory of the evening had nothing to do with money, business, or status. It was the reminder that true worth is never defined by a title, a paycheck, or someone else's opinion. It is revealed through integrity, humility, and the way a person treats others when they have every reason not to. And that was a lesson nobody at that table would ever forget.